Have you ever watched a single moment change everything you thought you knew about life? One quiet evening in Manhattan, a billionaire father sat at a table, convinced that money could shield his son from the world's harshness. His boy, Ethan, wore heavy braces on his legs, and to the father, weakness meant danger. But then a young black waitress bent down, offered her hand, and did the unthinkable. She let Ethan lead a dance step, right there on the restaurant floor. Imagine the shock a man used to commanding boardrooms now powerless before the courage of his own child. What would you do if life forced you to choose control out of fear or trust out of love? We've all faced moments when holding on feels safer than letting go. But what if letting go is the only way someone we love can truly rise? This is not just a story about wealth, race, or disability. It's a story about dignity, humility, and the steps we take when our hearts are tested. Stay with us, because once you hear what happened next, you'll never see leadership, love, or freedom the same way again. Like, share, and subscribe. Now let's step together into the story. The dining room at the Manhattan Crown glittered that evening, its chandeliers casting a golden light over polished marble floors and crystal glasses. It was the kind of restaurant where even laughter seemed restrained, where voices never rose above polite conversation, and where money was not only expected, but performed in every gesture. At the center table near the piano sat David Harrington, CEO of Harrington Global Holdings, a man whose name was etched on skyscrapers and whispered in boardrooms. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, his silver cufflinks gleaming. Yet beneath the polished exterior, David carried a constant weight, the double burden of power and perception. He had built an empire as a black man in a world that still, too often, questioned his place at the head of the table. This was the first time in nearly 2 years that David had brought his son Ethan out to dinner in public. Ethan was only 10, his hair a soft brown wave, his eyes bright but hesitant. Steel braces clamped both his legs, reminders of the car accident that had left him partially paralyzed. Every step Ethan took was accompanied by the scrape of metal, a sound that still made David wince inside. David had chosen this restaurant for its privacy and prestige. He wanted to ease his son back into the world, to show him that the Harrington name could shield him from whispers. But deep down, he also feared the opposite, that no amount of wealth could silence pitying eyes. The live pianist began a gentle melody, notes floating like silk through the air. Conversation slowed. Glasses touched lips. The world seemed to pause. And then, without warning, Ethan shifted in his chair. He looked toward the waitress who had just refilled their water glasses, Aaliyah Brooks, the only black server in the entire restaurant that night. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with calm eyes and a posture that suggested resilience. Her navy apron hung neatly, though her shoes had seen long hours. She met Ethan's gaze with a quick, kind smile, and then it happened. Ethan pushed back his chair. The scrape echoed, far louder than it should have. He stood, wobbling, his braces catching the light. His small hand stretched forward toward Aaliyah. "Would you dance with me?" he asked, his voice trembling yet clear. The restaurant froze. Cutlery hung in midair. Heads turned, eyes narrowing, whispers starting like sparks in dry grass. A boy in braces, asking a waitress to dance in this place. Before Aaliyah could respond, a sharp voice sliced through the silence. "Sir, control your son." It was Walter Green, the restaurant manager, tall, stiff, his tie knotted with military precision. His eyes burned with irritation, not at the child's bravery, but at the breach of etiquette. "This is not a dance hall," Green continued. and our staff are not here to entertain children." David felt the weight of 100 eyes. His throat tightened. He had rehearsed countless speeches in hostile boardrooms, had stared down rivals who wanted him to fail. Yet in this moment, with his son's hand still suspended in the air, he felt unprepared. "Ethan," David said, his voice low, firm, "sit down." The boy's eyes clouded with confusion. His hand wavered. For a moment, it seemed he would obey. But then Aaliyah did something that no one expected. She untied her apron. She folded it once, twice, and set it gently on the serving tray. Then she stepped forward and took Ethan's hand. "I can't dance in an apron," she said softly, her voice steady enough for the nearest tables to hear. The air thickened. A woman in pearls leaned to her companion and whispered, "She'll be fired tomorrow." David shot up from his chair. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it lay fear. Fear of scandal, of humiliation, of headlines waiting to be written. Aaliyah met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Ethan took a hesitant step forward. The metal brace screeched against the floor. He nearly stumbled, but Aaliyah adjusted her own pace, slow and deliberate, letting him lead. The pianist, sensing the moment, softened the melody. The room was silent except for the dragging brace and the fragile rhythm of the boy's determination. David's mind raced. He saw flashes of his late wife, Mariah, dancing with Ethan in their living room before the accident. He remembered her words, "It's not about perfection, it's about connection." Across the restaurant, someone stifled a laugh. Another whispered, "How inappropriate." But David could not tear his eyes away from his son. For the first time in years, Ethan's face was not twisted in frustration or shadowed by shame. His brows knit in concentration, his lips pressed but trembling upward almost impossibly. A smile. 3 steps. That was all. 3 halting, imperfect steps before Ethan stopped, exhausted but glowing. "Thank you for asking me," Aaliyah said, bowing slightly as if to an equal. "It was an honor." She began to turn away, but David's voice broke through. "Wait." The restaurant held its breath again. "What's your full name?" David asked. "Aaliyah Brooks, sir." He repeated it slowly, as if committing it to memory. Then, almost mechanically, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a card. His personal card, the one few ever received. "My office," he said. "Tomorrow. 10 a.m." Aaliyah accepted it, though her hand trembled slightly. She offered no thanks, only a nod, and walked away. "Dad," Ethan whispered once she was gone, "why did you do that?" David looked at his son. For the first time, he saw not just a child in braces, not just a fragile piece of his empire to protect. He saw a human being, a boy with wants, with courage, with a voice he had long silenced. Dinner continued in uneasy silence. Plates arrived and cooled. Conversation never fully returned. But in David's chest, something shifted. A storm gathered unfamiliar, unwelcome, and undeniable. The next morning, the sky over Manhattan was a pale gray, the kind that seemed to hang low between the skyscrapers. Inside Harrington Tower, the air smelled of polished wood, leather, and quiet power. Assistants hurried past in suits, their heels tapping like metronomes across marble floors. David Harrington sat in his office, his back to the glass wall that overlooked the city. From here, Central Park was nothing more than a smudge of green framed by concrete and glass. He often thought the view was supposed to symbolize victory, but lately it felt more like a cage built of his own achievements. On his desk lay the business card he had given to Aaliyah Brooks. He turned it over in his hand, not sure why he had insisted she come. Part of him was curious. Another part was defensive, perhaps even angry at himself for being moved by something as simple, as fragile, as 3 dance steps. He had not slept well. The whispers from the restaurant echoed in his head, the judgment in the manager's voice, the way Ethan had smiled God, that smile like he had been waiting years to lead, even just for a moment. David's assistant, Marlene, entered with a folder. She paused when she saw the expression on his face, but said nothing. She had worked for him long enough to know when silence was safer. "Sir," she said carefully, "your 10 o'clock is here." David nodded without turning. He adjusted his tie, straightened the cuff of his sleeve, and masked himself again with the face that had conquered hostile boardrooms and bent investors to his will. A knock. Then the door opened. Aaliyah Brooks stepped in. No apron now. She wore a navy skirt and a white blouse that was slightly faded, but pressed neatly. Her shoes were polished but clearly worn. She clutched a plain purse against her side, her chin held high. The contrast was sharp. She looked both out of place in this palace of glass and steel, and yet somehow she belonged like a reminder that reality existed beyond these walls. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted, her voice calm, neither deferential nor arrogant. "Miss Brooks," David replied, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Silence stretched between them, the kind that David usually used to make others uncomfortable. He had learned long ago that powerful men often didn't need to shout. They only needed to wait until others filled the air with nervous explanations. But Aaliyah didn't rush. She folded her hands in her lap and met his eyes steadily. Finally, David spoke. "Tell me, Miss Brooks, do you have a background education?" She tilted her head slightly. "Bachelor's degree in child development, NYU, and an unfinished master's in special education." David blinked. That was not the answer he had expected. "And yet you work as a waitress." "I work 3 jobs," she corrected. "The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, tutoring when I can. The bills don't wait for degrees. Mr. Harrington." Her tone was steady, almost matter-of-fact. But David caught the flicker of weariness beneath it. "I did some research after last night," he admitted. He reached for a folder on his desk, opening it to reveal photographs of children in wheelchairs, on crutches, braces, and prosthetics, smiling, dancing, their arms outstretched in joy. "Freedom Steps," David said. "You founded this, co-founded," she corrected again, "with my sister, Zoe, 6 years ago." David flipped through more pages. Financial reports, notes, requests for funding, some of which bore his foundation's rejection stamp. "It's about to close, isn't it?" Aaliyah didn't flinch. "Yes. We've been running on fumes for a year now." David closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. "I want you to work for me." Aaliyah's brows lifted slightly. "As a waitress in your house?" His jaw tightened. "As a therapeutic companion for my son?" "Ethan, I've hired the best specialists in the country, neurologists, physical therapists, psychologists. But what you did last night, I've never seen him smile like that since the accident. It was just a dance. Mr. Harrington." "No," David said firmly, leaning forward. "It was the first time I've seen him lead. The first time I've seen him free." His voice cracked on the last word. For a moment, he wasn't CEO David Harrington. He was just a father, desperate and lost. Aaliyah's eyes softened, but her words remained steady. "I can't accept." David stiffened. He wasn't used to hearing no. "You realize I could pay you 5 times what you make now. You wouldn't have to worry about bills again. I don't work for people who see only my color or my class before they see my competence," Aaliyah said quietly. "And I don't work for people who think money can buy solutions to emotional wounds." The words hit harder than any boardroom attack ever had. "You're turning down an offer that could solve all your financial problems," he said, his voice sharpening. "Not out of pride," she corrected, standing slowly, "out of dignity. And because your son deserves more than someone hired to pretend to care." She placed a small card on his desk, hand-printed, slightly bent at the corners. "Freedom Steps. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. 4 p.m. Bring Ethan, if you want. The first class is free." She turned to leave. David's lips parted, but no words came. He watched as she walked out, her footsteps steady, her back unbending. When the door closed, silence filled the office once more. David stared at the card. His reflection in its glossy surface looked tired, uncertain. He hated the feeling. He had spent a lifetime proving he belonged in rooms that were designed to exclude him. And yet here, in his own office, it felt as though the power he relied on so heavily meant nothing at all. Later that night, he sat in Ethan's room. The boy was fiddling with a model airplane, the braces still strapped to his legs. "Dad," Ethan asked quietly, "did you mean what you said at the restaurant? About seeing her again?" David hesitated. He thought of the whispers, the manager's disdain, the eyes that had cut through him. He thought of Aaliyah's words, of the sharp edge of truth in them. "Yes," he said finally. "We'll see her again." He didn't say it out of strategy. He said it because for the first time in years, he wasn't entirely sure what leading meant anymore. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps his son could teach him. The rain came heavy over Manhattan that Thursday afternoon. From his corner office on the top floor of Harrington Tower, David watched streaks of water blur the skyline. Normally, he welcomed storms. They reminded him of his childhood in Atlanta, when thunder rolled through the summer nights and his mother told him storms were just the sky washing itself clean. But today, the storm outside only mirrored the one within. On his desk lay the simple card Aaliyah had left behind. Freedom Steps. The letters were printed by hand, uneven, almost humble. In his world, everything was embossed, engraved, gilded. Yet this flimsy card had more weight than half the contract stacked beside it. David tapped it against the surface of his desk, restless. He had been replaying her words in his mind. Dignity, not pride. Money cannot buy care. His empire had been built on the assumption that everything loyalty, expertise, even silence had a price. But Aaliyah had shattered that assumption with nothing more than calm conviction. He had thought inviting her to his office would assert control, but instead, he had left the conversation unsettled, and unsettled was not a feeling David tolerated easily. That evening, Ethan sat at the dining table, pushing peas around his plate. His braces clinked faintly against the chair when he shifted. "Dad," he said suddenly, without looking up, "can we go to that place?" Freedom Steps. David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "You want to?" Ethan nodded. "She believed in me. She didn't try to fix me. She just followed. No one's done that since Mom." The words cut through David like a blade. He set his fork down, appetite gone. His late wife Mariah had always insisted Ethan could do more than doctors predicted. She had danced with him in the living room, sung to him when the pain was sharp. Since her death, David had replaced faith with structure, affection with strategy. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. "We'll see," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. That night, long after Ethan had gone to bed, David found himself searching online. He typed Freedom Steps Community Center into the browser. The website was simple, almost crude compared to the sleek designs of his corporations. Photos showed children of all backgrounds moving clumsily but joyfully, guided by volunteers. A tagline read, "Your rhythm, your rules." Beneath it was a short mission statement. Freedom Steps aimed to provide adaptive dance and movement therapy for children with physical challenges, focusing on autonomy, not correction. There were testimonials from parents. A girl with cerebral palsy who had learned to spin in her wheelchair. A boy with a prosthetic who had choreographed his own steps. Each story was written in the same raw, unpolished language, but it was undeniable they were stories of freedom. David closed the laptop with more force than necessary. He rubbed his temples, caught between admiration and resentment. He was a man used to control, and this program seemed designed to teach him the opposite. The following morning, he called Marlene into his office. "Arrange a meeting with Miss Brooks," he said. "She already declined your offer, sir." His jaw tightened. "Arrange it anyway." By late afternoon, Aaliyah stood in his office once more. She looked the same as before, neat, composed, carrying nothing but her worn purse. But this time, David noticed something he hadn't before: the steadiness of her breathing. The way she scanned the room, not with awe, but with quiet assessment, as if she had walked into boardrooms of power before. "Miss Brooks," David began, "I won't waste your time. You were right. Money doesn't solve everything. But I cannot ignore what happened the other night. My son, he hasn't been the same since." Aaliyah clasped her hands. "Then bring him to the center." "I don't want him to be a project in a community warehouse," David said, his tone sharper than he intended. "I want him to have the best, the very best. And that means you, focused entirely on him." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "The best doesn't mean isolation. It means belonging. What you're asking would take him out of community, out of shared experience. That isn't healing. Mr. Harrington, that's a gilded cage." David stood, restless, moving toward the window. He stared at the city, its endless avenues and towers. "Do you know what it's like," he said quietly, "to build everything only to watch your own child live half a life?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. He turned sharply, caught off guard. "My sister Zoe," Aaliyah explained. "She was born with scoliosis. So severe, doctors told my mother she'd never walk straight. But she did. Not because of surgery, not because of specialists, because she was stubborn, because she insisted on finding her own rhythm." David exhaled, long and heavy. "You're asking me to trust chaos," he said. "I'm asking you to trust freedom," she replied. He studied her for a long time. Then, almost against his will, he felt something loosen inside, the tight grip he had on every decision, every outcome. It terrified him. "Very well," he said at last, his voice low. "I'll come, just once, to see what this is about." Aaliyah's shoulders relaxed, though her eyes stayed sharp. "Not for me, Mr. Harrington. For him." As she left, the storm outside began to ease. The rain slowed, the clouds lifting just enough for a sliver of pale light to reach the city. David sat back down at his desk, staring at the card again. Freedom Steps. For the first time in years, he felt something strange stir in his chest. Not confidence, not fear, something far rarer. Hope. Saturday morning arrived cooler than expected. The September sun filtered through pale clouds, washing the city streets in muted gold. David Harrington stood in the marble foyer of his penthouse, adjusting the cuffs of his navy blazer. He told himself it was just another appointment, nothing more. Yet the nervous tightening in his chest betrayed him. Ethan sat nearby, braces strapped over his jeans, fingers drumming lightly against his wheelchair armrest. He had been buzzing with anticipation since waking up, asking every few minutes what time they would leave. "Dad, are you sure we're going?" Ethan asked now, eyes wide with cautious hope. David looked at him, and for a rare moment, softened. "Yes, we're going." The car ride to Harlem was silent at first. The driver navigated through midtown traffic, horns blaring, vendors calling, life spilling across sidewalks. Ethan pressed his forehead against the glass, watching as the glossy towers of Manhattan gave way to narrower streets, colorful murals, and brownstones with iron railings. David checked his phone twice, scanning unread emails, but the screen blurred. His mind was elsewhere on Aaliyah's words, on his wife's memory, on the fragile hope in his son's face. Finally, the car stopped in front of an old brick building with wide steps leading to a double door painted bright teal. Above it, a weathered sign read, "Freedom Steps Community Center." The paint had chipped, but someone had outlined the letters with fresh strokes, refusing to let them fade. Children's laughter drifted out the open windows. Music soft, rhythmic throbbed faintly in the background. David stepped out first, straightening his jacket. His instinct was to scan for danger, for judgment. He felt eyes on him, mothers holding toddlers, teens leaning against the railing, volunteers carrying water bottles and mats. A few whispered his name, recognizing him, the billionaire in their neighborhood. For the first time in years, David felt out of place, not because he lacked wealth or power, but because here, those things meant nothing. Ethan wheeled himself forward eagerly. "Come on, Dad. Inside." The air smelled faintly of wood polish and citrus cleaner. The lobby walls were covered with photographs of children mid-dance, arms raised, feet lifted, wheels spinning. Their expressions radiated joy, defiance, freedom. Aaliyah appeared at the end of the hallway. She wasn't wearing her waitress uniform. Instead, she had on black leggings, a loose gray t-shirt, and sneakers. A whistle hung from a cord around her neck. Her hair was pulled back, and a faint sheen of effort already glistened on her forehead. "Mr. Harrington," she greeted calmly. "Ethan, you made it." David gave a short nod, the practiced kind that closed most deals. But here, it felt flimsy. "Class is about to start," Aaliyah said. "You can watch from the side. Or," her gaze lingered on him, "you can join." David almost laughed. Him dancing. He hadn't let go like that in decades. His life had been about control, precision, performance. Dancing meant surrender. "I'll watch," he said stiffly. Aaliyah simply nodded, leading Ethan toward the studio. The room was wide, lined with mirrors and scuffed wooden floors. Bright murals of musical notes and silhouettes of dancers stretched across the walls. Children of all ages filled the space, some with braces, others in wheelchairs, a few using crutches or prosthetic limbs. Volunteers knelt beside them, adjusting straps, offering encouragement. Ethan's eyes lit up. For once, he wasn't the only one with braces. "Circle up," Aaliyah called, her voice carrying easily. The children formed a loose ring. Ethan maneuvered himself into the circle, uncertain at first, But no one stared. No one whispered. He was simply part of it. David leaned against the wall, arms folded. He tried to analyze, to measure. But something in him began to unravel as the music swelled and the children started to move. It wasn't polished, not by any professional standard. Feet missed beats, wheels squeaked, limbs stumbled. Yet there was a rhythm deeper than perfection raw. Alive, defiant. Aaliyah clapped in time, guiding gently. "Don't copy me," she said. "Find your step, your way." Ethan hesitated, his braces locked for a moment. But then, slowly, he pushed himself forward. One step, another. Aaliyah moved beside him, not leading, not correcting, just mirroring. Her presence was a quiet anchor. David's throat tightened. His son wasn't just walking, he was leading. Suddenly, a boy with a prosthetic leg stumbled, nearly falling. The circle froze. Before David could react, Ethan wheeled forward, extending a hand. "You got it," he said softly. The boy grinned, steadied himself, and the circle erupted in cheers. David blinked hard. He felt something he hadn't allowed in years, a crack in the armor. Pride, sharp and overwhelming, mixed with grief for all the moments he had missed. As the class ended, children collapsed onto mats, laughing breathlessly. Ethan's face glowed with sweat and joy. David approached, uncertain. "Did you see me?" Dad Ethan asked, eyes shining. "I helped him. I didn't just walk. I led." David's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, he reached down and squeezed Ethan's shoulder. For once, his silence spoke louder than any polished speech. Aaliyah walked over, handing Ethan a bottle of water. Her gaze flicked briefly to David. "Well," she asked. David swallowed, still struggling to find words. "It was remarkable. It was freedom," she corrected softly. For a long moment, the three of them stood in quiet, the buzz of children echoing around them. On the ride home, Ethan hummed the class's closing song under his breath. His fingers tapped out rhythms on his lap. David stared out the window, his reflection blurring against the city lights. He had walked into that center as a man of control, of contracts, of power. He had left carrying something he hadn't expected. Possibility. And the unsettling realization that perhaps he had more to learn from his son than his son could ever learn from him. The following week at Harrington Tower, the air carried its usual scent of polished wood and expensive cologne. But David Harrington couldn't focus on business. Numbers blurred on spreadsheets. Conversations about mergers and quarterly reports drifted past him without landing. His mind replayed Ethan's laugh from the community center, the steady rhythm of his son's steps, the way he had helped another child instead of shrinking back. It unsettled David more than he admitted. For years, he had prided himself on building walls between himself and grief, between his power and vulnerability. Now, one dance class in a rundown center had cracked the foundation. At lunch, he joined his board of directors in the executive dining room. Polished silverware clinked against porcelain. Voices discussed markets in London, real estate in Dubai, and an acquisition in Seattle. Halfway through, one of the directors, Richard Cole, leaned in with a smirk. "Heard a curious story. Harrington, someone saw you up in Harlem. Community center, of all places." The table chuckled politely. David's fork froze. He forced a smile, the kind that usually silenced gossip. But Richard pressed on. "Tell me, David, what's a man like you doing in a place like that, looking for new investment opportunities?" Another round of laughter. "Or maybe charity," another voice added. "Though I thought you left that to the foundation staff." David set his fork down deliberately. He looked around the table, meeting each gaze in turn. I was there for my son." His tone was calm but edged with steel. The laughter died. Someone cleared their throat. Another shifted uncomfortably. Richard raised his glass as if in surrender. Of course. To family." The conversation moved on, but David felt the heat rising in his chest. It wasn't just their mockery. It was the memory of how easily people had dismissed him in that restaurant, how quickly status could flip when race or disability entered the picture. And now, even in his own circle of supposed equals, the same quiet disdain lurked beneath polite smiles. That evening, he sat in Ethan's room as his son practiced tapping rhythms with his hands. Ethan's braces were off, resting beside the bed. "Dad," Ethan said, glancing up, "can I go back Thursday?" David hesitated. "We'll see." Ethan frowned. "You always say that." David looked away. The truth was, part of him feared returning, not because of the center, but because of what it revealed about him, how much he had missed, how much he had hidden behind money and control. Later that night, David poured himself a drink and stood by the window, the city sprawling beneath him. He remembered his mother's voice when he was a boy in Atlanta. "Don't let them tell you what you can't be. David, don't let them shrink you." He had taken her advice to heart, clawing his way into boardrooms that had no seat for him. But somewhere along the way, he had shrunk his own son, measuring Ethan by limits, by what specialists said, by what he feared. The next Thursday, he forced himself to return to Freedom Steps. Ethan practically hummed with excitement the entire ride. Inside the studio, the music thumped gently, children already circling up. Aaliyah smiled when she saw them. "Welcome back." This time, David didn't retreat to the wall. He stood closer, arms still folded but eyes sharper, taking in every detail. Halfway through class, Aaliyah clapped her hands. "Partners today. Remember, you don't lead by pulling. You lead by listening." Ethan hesitated, glancing at his father. David gave a small nod. A volunteer paired Ethan with a girl in a wheelchair. Their steps were awkward at first, wheels squeaking against the floor, but slowly they found a rhythm. Ethan laughed, guiding gently, then letting her guide him in return. David's chest tightened again. It was both beautiful and painful to watch. After class, as parents gathered coats and children chattered, David pulled Aaliyah aside. "You're teaching them more than dance," he said quietly. She met his gaze evenly. "I'm reminding them they already have what they need. Sometimes the world convinces them otherwise." David's jaw tightened. "The world isn't kind, Miss Brooks." "No," she agreed softly. "But that doesn't mean we stop being kind ourselves." The words lodged in his chest. Later, outside, as they waited for the car, a man approached, middle-aged, wearing a faded work jacket. His eyes lingered on David, then shifted to Ethan. "You're Harrington, right?" the man asked gruffly. David straightened, bracing for confrontation. "Yes." "My boy's in there, too," the man said. "Wheelchair. Been fighting insurance for years. Never thought he'd dance again." He paused, voice thickening. "Thank you. Whatever reason you're here, thank you." David was caught off guard. He nodded awkwardly. "Your son is strong." The man gave a small smile and walked away. In the car, Ethan looked at his father. "Did you hear that?" "Dad, he thanked you." David stared out the window, his reflection ghosting back at him. He felt the weight of something larger than business, larger than image, a shift he couldn't yet name. But with each visit, the tension grew. At home, Ethan blossomed more confident, more alive. At work, whispers spread. A billionaire CEO in Harlem dancing. Some mocked, some questioned his judgment. One evening, Marlene hesitated at his office door. "Sir, there's talk. Investors asking if you're distracted. The press sniffing around." David set his pen down. Let them sniff. But when she left, he sat alone in the dim light, the old fear gnawing at him. He had fought too hard to be dismissed, too hard to protect his son. Could he risk it all now? Yet even as fear rose. Another image returned Ethan's smile, radiant and free, in that circle of children. And for the first time in decades, David Harrington realized he was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous and far more important than any corporate battle he had ever fought. By the time spring sunlight melted the last of the Manhattan frost, the whispers had turned into headlines. Billionaire CEO seen at Harlem dance program. David Harrington's new interest charity or distraction. The financial press dissected every move. Investors speculated about his focus, and late-night hosts cracked jokes. What unsettled David most wasn't the noise outside. It was the steady change inside his own home. Ethan was different. His voice carried more confidence, his body more certainty. He no longer hid behind baggy sweaters or shuffled with eyes down. At the breakfast table, he once announced, "Dad, I want to show my classmates I can dance." David nearly choked on his coffee. "Dance at school." Ethan nodded, grinning. "There's a spring showcase. Miss Brooks said I should do it." David's first instinct was no. Too risky. Too much room for humiliation. But Ethan's eyes, bright, insistent, pulled him back. "We'll talk about it," David muttered. That same week, the Harrington Foundation Board called an emergency meeting. Around the mahogany table, suits leaned forward, tension humming in the air. "David," one trustee began, "this Freedom Steps program is drawing media attention. There are questions about racial optics, about why our foundation rejected their proposals 3 times, yet suddenly appears connected." Another added, "It looks manipulative, opportunistic." The words stabbed deep, because they carried truth. For years, he had dismissed proposals like Aaliyah's without reading past the first page. He kept his voice measured. "This isn't optics. It's about results. My son walked his first step there." A silence fell. Then Richard Cole, ever the cynic, leaned forward. "With respect, David, we're not in the business of following personal miracles. We manage a global reputation, aligning with a grassroots program led by—" He trailed off, then added carefully, "a waitress. Could be risky." David's jaw locked. For a moment, the old Harrington sharp, ruthless, untouchable, rose to the surface. Riskier than ignoring what works. His voice cut like glass. Riskier than dismissing children because they don't fit into our polished brochures. The board shifted uneasily. That night, David sat in his study, the city buzzing beneath his windows. He poured bourbon, but didn't drink. He stared at the photo of Ethan on his desk, braces glinting, smile uncertain. What if they're right, he thought. What if this ruins everything I've built? Then another memory broke through his late wife, Angela, spinning Ethan around their living room before the accident. Her laughter had been free, unguarded. She had whispered once, "Don't let fear make him small." David pressed his palms to his face. For the first time, he admitted what he had never said aloud. He had failed her, and he was failing Ethan still. The following Thursday, he and Ethan arrived at Freedom Steps to find the center buzzing with reporters, cameras, microphones, questions flying. A journalist shoved forward, Mr. Harrington, are you funding this program after years of rejecting it? Is this a publicity stunt? David froze, flashes blinding him. Ethan shrank behind his father's leg. Then Aaliyah stepped forward, voice calm but firm. This is not a stunt. It's children reclaiming their rhythm. You're welcome to watch, but you will not disrupt them. Her authority silenced even the press for a beat. David looked at her, startled by the strength in her small frame. She didn't flinch. Inside, class began as usual. But the air buzzed with tension, cameras clicking behind the glass. Midway through, Ethan suddenly tugged at Aaliyah's sleeve. "Can I show them? Show what she asked?" He grinned nervously. "The step I've been practicing." Before she could answer, Ethan wheeled himself to the center. Slowly, deliberately, he unlatched one brace. Gas rippled. David surged forward, panic flashing. "Ethan, stop!" But Aaliyah raised a hand. "Wait. Let him." Ethan steadied himself, gripping his crutch. The room went silent. Children, parents, reporters, step by shaky step. He crossed the floor, not guided, not corrected, not pitied, just moving, fully his own. When he reached the other side, applause erupted, children cheered, cameras flashed, reporters shouted. David stood frozen, tears burning behind his eyes. His son had just done what specialists swore impossible, and he had done it alone. But before the joy could settle, Richard Cole's voice echoed from the back of the room. He had come with the press. "This proves nothing," he sneered. "You're exploiting a child for spectacle." The room hushed. All eyes turned to David. He could lash out, could defend himself with the old weapons of power and fury. Instead, he heard Aaliyah's earlier words. "You don't lead by pulling. You lead by listening." David stepped forward, voice steady. "No, this proves everything. That for too long. I measured my son by limits, that I dismissed the voices who knew better, that I hid behind money and missed what truly matters." Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. He turned to face Richard. "You call it risk. I call it truth. From this day forward, the Harrington Foundation will fully fund Freedom Steps and expand it to reach children nationwide. And Aaliyah Brooks will lead it, without interference." The room erupted. Some cheered, some gasped. Richard stormed out. But David only saw Ethan, his son, beaming with pride, chest heaving with effort, but eyes alight with victory. For the first time, David Harrington felt something stronger than power. He felt freedom. 3 months after the confrontation at Freedom Steps, bulldozers stood where weeds once grew in Harlem. Steel beams rose slowly into the spring sky, workers shouting directions over the hum of machinery. The Harrington Foundation's newest project was no gleaming tower or art museum. It was something humbler, rawer, more alive, a rehabilitation and movement center designed by children and families themselves. David Harrington walked the site in a hard hat, not in his usual tailored suit, but in rolled-up sleeves, clipboard in hand. To the surprise of staff and reporters, he came often. He didn't simply fund the project, he learned its language. He studied diagrams of ramps and sensory rooms, asked questions about flooring that absorbed impact, even argued for windows that let in maximum sunlight because children shouldn't heal in shadows. Ethan was by his side almost every visit, sometimes with braces, sometimes daring just one crutch. He sketched in a small notebook, suggesting bright murals for the walls. "Dad," he said one afternoon, pointing at a corner, "that's where the music room should go. A place for drums, so even kids who can't walk can still feel rhythm." David ruffled his son's hair. Music room it is. It wasn't only Ethan who flourished. Aaliyah and her sister Zoe guided meetings, bringing in parents, therapists, and architects. Their voices, once dismissed, now carried authority. Dr. Elaine Mercer returned, overseeing research trials that documented the program's effects. One evening, after a long day at the site, David sat in a folding chair, staring at the skeletal frame of the building. Aaliyah joined him, sipping water. "You look tired," she said. "Board meetings are easier than this," he admitted, "but this feels real." She studied him for a moment. "You've changed," he gave a soft laugh. "Or maybe I'm just finally seeing." She didn't press. Instead, she pointed at the beams. "Do you know why I named it Freedom Steps?" David shook his head. Because the first step a child takes without fear, whether it's with their feet, their wheels, or their voice, that step is freedom. That's what we build here. David's throat tightened. He thought of Ethan's shaky but determined stride across the studio floor that day. "You gave him that." Aaliyah shook her head gently. "He gave it to himself. I just made space." The words stayed with David long after. By the time the center opened 6 months later, the transformation was visible not just in steel and glass, but in hearts. Families filled the airy halls, children darting or rolling through spaces designed just for them. Walls were splashed with murals painted by kids, bright blues and oranges shouting hope. The opening ceremony drew hundreds. Cameras lined the back. Journalists murmured about the billionaire's unusual devotion. Politicians angled for photos, but David ignored them all. His eyes stayed on Ethan. The boy, now moving with only a lightweight brace, stood in the center with 3 other children. Together, they performed a short routine, simple, imperfect, but radiant with confidence. Ethan even led a younger child, steadying her when she faltered. Applause thundered. Some parents wept openly. David felt something swell in his chest that he couldn't name, something greater than pride, greater than relief. Afterward, a reporter approached with a microphone. "Mr. Harrington, what does today mean to you?" David looked at Ethan, who was laughing with friends. "Pride," he said slowly, "not in what he's overcome, but in what he's created for others." The reporter pressed, "And what have you learned personally?" David met the camera directly, his voice clear. The true leaders aren't the ones who drag others down the path they think is right. They're the ones who have the courage to follow when someone shows them a better way. The quote ricocheted through media. Overnight, clips of David's words spread online. From ruthless CEO to humbled father. One headline read, "A billionaire learns to follow." Another declared, but David cared little for headlines. What mattered was what unfolded in the weeks after. Parents who had once felt invisible now spoke with authority. Children who had once been pitied now were celebrated. Ethan, who once shrank from attention, now stood taller, even serving as a youth spokesperson for Freedom Steps. One quiet evening, David lingered after a board meeting at the new center. He found Ethan helping a girl adjust her crutch, patient and encouraging. Watching them, he felt the sharp ache of memory, Angela's laughter, her plea not to let fear shrink their boy. Aaliyah joined him, her voice low. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore." David nodded, eyes still on Ethan. "No. But he still needs me to be here. That's the difference." She smiled faintly. "That's enough." For the first time in decades, David Harrington believed her. 1 year later, the Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center pulsed with life. The once empty lot had become a sanctuary of rhythm and resilience, where children of every background discovered that their limitations did not define them. Bright murals covered the walls, a boy with braces leaping into color. A girl in a wheelchair painted like a comet streaking across the stars. David Harrington often walked those halls quietly, almost unrecognizable without his tailored suits. He listened more than he spoke, learning the stories of families who had once felt invisible in the city's rush. Every visit reminded him that wealth could build walls or it could break them down. Ethan had blossomed beyond recognition. Now 11, he used only a lightweight cane on difficult days. His confidence radiated, his voice carried in classrooms and community meetings alike. At Freedom Steps, he was not just a participant, but a mentor, helping younger children discover their own rhythm. Parents often whispered in awe about his patience, his quiet strength. One afternoon, David stood at the back of a packed auditorium as Ethan took the stage for a youth conference. The boy gripped the microphone, a little shaky, but his voice soon steadied. "My dad used to think I needed someone to hold me all the time," Ethan said, smiling at David and the crowd. "But what I needed was space to try. Even if I fell, Freedom Steps gave me that. And now I want every kid who feels small to know they can take their own first step." The audience rose in thunderous applause. David's throat tightened. Pride swelled, but so did humility. His son wasn't just walking, he was leading. The impact spread beyond Harlem. Within a year, branches of Freedom Steps opened in 3 new cities: Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles, funded by a mix of foundation support and community donations. Hospitals began incorporating the program's methods into rehabilitation units. Universities cited Aaliyah and Dr. Mercer's research in journals. But with recognition came scrutiny. Some commentators accused David of using Freedom Steps to polish his legacy. Others said he was diluting corporate focus. Yet every time the noise threatened to drown him, David returned to the simple image of his son's smile. No headline mattered more than that. One evening, sitting on the rooftop garden of the new center, David and Aaliyah shared a rare quiet moment. The city sparkled around them, but the sounds of children's laughter carried from the floors below. "You've built something bigger than you know," Aaliyah said. "We built it," David corrected softly. She studied him, then asked, "Why do you still come here, when you could delegate it all?" David leaned back, exhaling slowly. "Because for the first time, I'm not leading, I'm following, and it feels right." Aaliyah nodded, her gaze softening. "That's the lesson most powerful people never learn." The silence stretched, comfortable now. Months later, the Harrington Foundation hosted its annual gala. Unlike previous years of glittering exclusivity, this one was different. Instead of tuxedos and distant speeches, the stage belonged to the children of Freedom Steps. They danced, wheeled, tapped, and sang, filling the hall with raw joy. Wealthy donors wept openly. Executives whispered about rethinking their own philanthropy. At the end of the night, David stood with Ethan at his side. Cameras flashed, but his words were not for the press. "To those who ask why a billionaire spends his time here," he said, "I'll answer simply, because my son taught me that true power is not control, it is presence, not leading every step, but knowing when to follow." Oh, Ethan squeezed his father's hand. In the days that followed, media outlets framed it as a redemption story. Business schools analyzed it as a case study in leadership transformation. But for David, it was neither spectacle nor strategy. It was life, finally lived in rhythm with his son. The legacy of Freedom Steps was not only new buildings or innovative research. It was the invisible shift in families who felt seen, in children who dared to rise. in a society forced to question how it defined strength. For David, the greatest lesson was simple. You cannot buy dignity, nor engineer transformation from above. You must enter the circle, risk stumbling, and let others lead you forward. On a quiet Sunday morning, David visited Angela's grave. He brought no flowers, only a small photo of Ethan balancing on one crutch, mid-step, joy radiating from his face. He laid the photo gently on the stone. "He's leading now. Angie," he whispered, "and I'm finally learning to follow." The breeze carried the sound of distant music from a nearby park, children playing. David closed his eyes, letting the rhythm wash over him. For the first time, the man who had once controlled every move of his empire felt at peace with letting go. Freedom, he realized, was not in wealth or walls of glass. It was in the courage to trust, to follow, and to love without fear. And that was the true legacy. As we grow older, we learn that strength is not always about control. It is often about knowing when to release it. This story reminds us that dignity is not granted by wealth or status, but by the courage to see others, truly see them in their humanity. The billionaire father discovered that love requires humility. He could not shield his son forever. By allowing him to stumble, to try, to lead, he gave him the gift of becoming. For many of us, this lesson echoes deeply. We've all tried to protect our children, our loved ones, our communities, sometimes holding too tightly. But life whispers that real growth comes when we loosen our grip and let others walk their own path, even if it means they fall first. The story also calls us to reflect on respect. A waitress, often invisible in society's eyes, became the teacher of both father and son. It reminds us that wisdom often arrives from places we least expect. In our everyday lives, perhaps the greatest legacy we can leave is not control, but trust, not dominance, but presence, and not fear, but hope. Thank you for spending your time with us and sharing in this powerful journey. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories of dignity, courage, and hope to life. Together, we can keep these voices alive